Today, we're going to welcome to Books at Berklee, Eunice Flanders. Eunice is a 10-year Berklee assistant professor in the Department of Liberal Arts, dedicated to teaching history through literature. After training with Dr. Beverly Daniels Tatum, a Black psychologist who specializes in issues of identity, Eunice committed to teaching issues of identity. Thus, her college writing classes focus on various literature from Indigenous Americans, aiming to facilitate students in understanding both U.S. history and what personal historical elements impact and form how they see themselves. Welcome, Eunice.
Hello. Hi, Judy.
Today, we're going to be talking about the novel There by Tommy Orange. You introduced me to this book, and I have to say, it was one of the best written contemporary novels I've read in a long time.
Oh, good.
At the opening of this novel, the author, Tommy Orange, starts off with the foundational premise of Indian identity, that of an oppressed people who had a genocide committed against them. How does this premise affect the reading of a novel that deals with a real issue of history?
Well, one of the points that I see Orange making is that all history is ultimately personal in how it affects people. And the past history or history lived has an effect on all who live it, even those who don't personally know some of the horror. And as we may or may not know, as a culture here in the US, the Native culture experienced a genocide. And I see in the way that he structured the novel with weaving together both historical documentations of things like the rolling Indian head and the Indian head on a coin, as you know, and that's by the way, a tale told by the Cheyenne Indian. In the story, this, he includes in that part of the novel a story about this rolling head that becomes confused and drunk and wants more and more of anything and everything. And that's kind of a precursor to what happens with characters, some of the characters in the novel.
Oh.
I think he's also using that idea of the image and educating readers about the traditional Indian head. And as we see culturally here in the US, that's being challenged, as for example, the Washington Redskins have now went to change their name and remove that. That idea about the mascot of the Indian head being a stereotype and making invisible, in a way, the cultures and the complexity of cultures that the natives have among the tribes. And, behind every image or idea of a person is a much more complex reality. And so the novel, I think, really illustrates that and makes each of the characters complicated, even the characters that are so-called the bad characters. Mm-hmm. He's really complicating and moving and striving to move against the stereotype. So that's the image of the traditional Indian head, which is currently challenged, as I was saying. There's real stories, there's personal stories. And those stories, every story reflects an individual experience, but also a collective experience. Some might be able to toss off the notion of, it being like the Washington Redskins and the use of that Indian head as, being overly sensitive. Why do we have to get rid of it? Don't understand, that there's a whole full history that's very complicated behind that. And, you know, as a postmodern author, he's weaving history with his fiction in a piece by piece manner through each of these characters. And so it does make the novel more complicated, I think, to understand, as it doesn't follow the traditional narrative arc, because you don't really, you know, it's delayed in understanding how all of these characters are connected. But to me, that's what makes it a complicated yet very rich book. And so the prologue and the interlude, which comes partway or halfway approximately through the novel, he's providing historical context that influences generational history and individual history for each of the characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite interesting and intriguing the way he allows the reader to step into the shoes or see through the eyes of an Indian who may have all kinds of symbolic and other meaning attached to things that an average, quote, white American or person who's not an indigenous Indian, Native American may not know or understand or see why that image has that symbolic meaning to them. And so that is one of the first things that we get from the author, is this ability to see into the eyes or through the eyes of the characters, which was extraordinary. And there are very few authors who can do that to the quality that he did. The characters in this novel really deal with life and death issues in dramatic ways. Even though the writing is done in a way that seems, oh, this is just what's going on in somebody's life. Yet really, there's quite a lot of drama going on. How does the author build this sense of precariousness of, the lives of the characters are so precarious in so many stories?
Well, what's interesting is that he uses throughout and within each character both like a first person perspective. So, for example, the first character, Tony Loneman, you're totally inside Tony's own mind as the narrative voice, and you are experiencing his thoughts. But then he also moves into third person, and that allows for, I think, a different way of characterization. And so, that movement of back and forth, being inside and then outside looking in somewhat, and then the responses between characters that later become, as we realize toward the end of the book, related in some way. He is very cleverly, a master of drawing characters so that even though that character, as you get to know them and understand them, has a world not like mine as a privileged white educated person, there are moments in the narrative voice or voices where, and students will say this to me, I can really relate to this character. And they'll talk about how Tommy Orange has somehow, created thoughts or reactions which are universal. He's really tapping into a lot of what it means to be a human. And humans are complicated. And so his characterization is, I think, amazing. And the details of what and how he portrays each of the characters is amazing.
I thought you really hit on something where the author takes us inside and outside of a character. And so this stepping in and looking at yourself from away, and then also being inside and seeing that very personal viewpoint, that writer or the author doing that you know, in so many ways, inside the community, outside the community, inside the individual, outside the individual. And these individual experiences being identified to the reader, you know, both as an individual and universal aspect, so that the individual nature of the experience and the particular nature of the experience, and yet how that is also universal at the same time. And that's really quite something, and that he builds into the characters, and in the way he's writing and his message. So that was really remarkable. One of the other things that's so remarkable about the novel is how he weaves in these really important social issues of the day. One that struck me particularly, that was something that I really was focused on when I was reading about it, was the Native American women who are facing such serious issues of rape, disappearance, poverty, you know, after generations of abuse and neglect, cultural deprivation of culture, and so on. How does the author allow us to view sort of these people who have experienced all of these terrible situations, still have this largeness of humanity? These women, despite their difficult lives, are just portrayed with such, you know, really loving depth of who they are.
Yeah, I think the character in particular, Jackie, is one who, for me, so Jackie is someone who has experienced homelessness, loss of her, abandoned by her father, loss of her mother, sexual abuse, alcoholism, suicide by her daughter. I mean, it's amazing. She doesn't herself, even though she does, I think at points, struggle with suicidal ideation. She is a really interesting character because she, in Native culture, there's like the warrior, and she's a warrior and overcoming so much adversity. And despite these flaws, like one thing that bothers me personally is how she ends up meeting Harvey, who impregnated her with her first child, who eventually she ends up meeting at the powwow, but she doesn't forgive him. They meet accidentally at a AA meeting. And I'm irritated at times by her, her resistance, because clearly I see Harvey as transformed. Yet, she progresses, she changes. I mean, one marker of a good novel is where we see the transformation of character. And Tony Loneman, who's involved in helping organize the shoot up at the powwow, which is where the novel ends, he's transformed. Mm-hmm. He ends up, and I tell students, and I argue that he's a hero in the end, because he decides to turn against this group of other people that are going to rob the powwow. But this, in the women in particular, and then Opal, her sister, Jackie's sister, who rescues her children, her sons. Jackie's got sons that Opal, and they eventually reunite. And her actual kind of denial of her heritage, Opal denies her heritage, yet, she works as a postal worker. She just shows up and is that steady, great sister that, rises again above the same circumstances of abandonment, loss of the mother, homelessness, and the courage that it, and again, to fight against these wheels that I see as being historically, my mom worked with poor people in Vermont. My mom worked with the natives during World War II in the Navajo reservation, and that, reaching for hope to rise above. Orange creates these characters that, you have to admire. for the
Yeah.
strength that they
Yeah.
show.
Yeah. That this sort of the inner strength or the inner core of the people is really comes through in so many different ways. Although there is a tremendous amount of issue about suicide, which is a major factor in the life of many Native American communities. And it's such a tragic thing that people are so overwhelmed by their circumstances. How does the author touch on this tragic topic in the novel and still, walk that balance of positivity there's and hope for a future of the community that is clearly also a thread in the book?
Well, just to educate the audience, and again, I try to educate my students as well. 80% of the natives on the reservation are alcohol drug addicted. The reservations were meant to, almost like camps, death camps. They were meant to really eliminate or isolate the natives, and there are lots of improvements, but a statistic around suicide is that according to the CDC, in 2018, the rate among I'm going to just read you this statistic. It's been increasing among the Native population since 2013, and in 2015, according to the CDC, the suicide rates in 18 states among the natives were 21.5% higher per 1,000 than any other racial or ethnic group. So among Native Americans, 40% of those who die by suicide are between the ages of 15 and 24. And the pandemic has not made it any better.
No.
But I've researched a little bit of this, and there is some research that shows that colonialism, and this is where the wheels of history tromp on and continue to tromp on. It's, and again, I saw this with my mother in Vermont among those that suffer from poverty. It's very hard to stop the cycle of a certain way of approaching life. And Tommy Orange illustrates that. But, I think one moment, a lot of it is to overcome the drug abuse and alcoholism. And there's a video that I show where one of the social workers working with Indigenous talks about how kids will, because of food insecurity, they'll drink at very young ages leftovers of these juicy drinks that are in the household, and all of this leads to the problems that exist. But again, so overcoming alcoholism and drug addiction is a very big push among all of the tribes. Part of my training with Beverly Tatum was to go to a powwow, and you won't go to a powwow and not see some sort of drug and alcohol education. Berklee just had a small concert of some of my former students, one Indigenous young woman from California, and they had partnered with the local group in Boston, and there was information and education about alcoholism and drug addiction at that function. It was a concert. And so I think, again, Tommy Orange illustrates that, but then we see this moment where Jackie is at this is where she meets Harvey, and there's a small fridge with those little samples. She literally ends up taking that and pushing it into the pool to get rid of it and to get out of that. And then there's another character who's a drummer, and it's like, in a way, drumming, he's struggling with alcoholism, and the drumming he, in a way, removes him out of that mindset. And so, of course, I believe that the way out, and I think in some ways what we see among the characters, because there are some that are pretty highly educated and less educated. The wheels of oppression, as I said, they cause poverty. They drive people into, having to deal drugs like some of the characters do. The people that rob, they're suffering the consequences of oppression. And it's illustrated, and yet you also have these characters that are like Harvey, who is the MC for the powwow that drives the character Jackie to the powwow. They've risen above and beyond, and education is a way of doing it. Edwin Black is a character who rises through education. And so of course I believe that too, and it's modeled within the characters of the book. Orange models that, and it's his story too. He didn't even start reading until he was after college. I don't know if you got a chance to look at that NPR article about him, but he was a late reader. And now he's committed his life to working at an Indian art school in New Mexico, and fostering and educating among the indigenous and natives, so that they too can become artists like he is. It's amazing, because this is his first novel.
Yeah. One of the things that was quite striking is the quality of the writing was so good. It's often said that the role of art is to reflect life, but also the role of art is to give a perspective that, that life could be better, or that life could change. And I guess that one of the aspects of the role of this novel has been this idea or thread that still seems to seep through all this tragedy, even the tragic denouement of the stories, that there is hope. We get that glimmer of hope, certainly at the end, and yet we don't really know what happens.
Exactly. He uses ambiguity.
You're left hanging to know, you want more, which is great in a novel. But what aspects of this role of art, to present hope, do you feel is in this book?
Well, I'm going to read you a quote by Pablo Picasso about art. And he said, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie to make us realize truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of his lies."
Interesting.
And I think that applies to this novel, is that what Orange is able to do, like the death of Tony Loneman, who's an alcohol syndrome kid who is dealing drugs on the side to help, and it's such a sweet relationship with it, loving relationship with his grandmother who's taking care of him. And in the end, where he's going to die, but then those birds, Tommy Orange uses the birds. We talk about this in the class of just, what does that mean?
Yeah.
But it's so beautiful. But, to me, being raised Christian, and not that I'm necessarily identified that way anymore, but the beauty of nature. And, then I tie in with what I know about Native traditions of belief, that this is not all there is, that there is more. The moment where we don't know whether or not Jackie's son who gets shot is going to make it. And then, you have to be a very close reader to pay attention to how Opal, who's very suspicious, and it's funny because when I'm walking my dog, I notice numbers and I start adding up the numbers, and seven's a lucky number. This is the way Opal is.
Yeah.
And the door swinging when the surgeon comes out, You know, she has a thing about even numbers, is on an even number. So I think that what Orange is doing is very subtly hinting, yes, he's using like an artist, you know, and Picasso, he didn't draw like realistic in Illustrator. He's hinting at the thing. And I think that, you know, Tommy Orange is hinting at the thing that, you know, is this a totally sad book? No, it isn't. But you really have to pay attention to his language and to his details. You know, like they say in fiction, if a gun goes off, you know, you've got to notice that. Well, you've got to notice everything that he does. You know, this is a book you have to read closely and pay attention.
Yeah, everything has comes back to play into the total picture. And he weaves everything back in. I guess one of the themes of the book that I felt was whether being a Native American is nature or nurture. That discussion, whether being an Indian is based on inheritance through family descent or from learned or inherited culture. That discussion happens a lot in this book. How is this balance between the arguments, nature versus nurture, played out in this novel?
Well, I think
both.
there are 12 characters, and of the 12 characters, various and Orange in interviews talks about how he wanted to portray characters in various relationship to their native identity. And there are some that identify more strongly than others, and some go to the internet to learn more about their tradition, to how to drum. And so because of the knowledge, whether or not they are close to their native roots or not, there is a feeling that there's something to being native, you know, like inherent, like nature. You know, and Thomas Frank, the drummer that I was mentioning, who's alcoholic and ends up getting fired, he in the womb, you know, is described as in the womb was drumming, so that it's like the, you know, nature. And then Dean Oxendine, who's the film guy who's collecting the stories, is trying to, you know, use the environment to draw in to understand himself as a native person. So he collects stories because he inherits a camera when his favorite uncle dies of alcoholism. So I don't think the answer of nature versus nurture is really answered. But you know, because that's a cycle. I have a couple of bachelors, and one of my bachelors is in psychology, and you know, that nature versus nurture dilemma is one of the basic things you learn. So again, it's not ever answered, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, it plays itself out through various characters again, depending on, as Orange hoped to portray, these various characters who are in various relationship with it. Some seek it out. Opal, Jackie's sister, completely discourages getting, you know, understanding for her kids. It's like she's in denial.
Yeah.
She doesn't want anything to do with Native because it was so painful.
And on the other hand, she holds on to those costumes.
Exactly.
You know, that part, she can't quite let go of that.
Exactly.
So, there's something there. You know, it's this little thread, the thread of connection.
Yeah. And Blue, who's the daughter of Jackie that with Harvey, she ends up learning when she's in her 20s, because she was put up for adoption. She grows up in white privileged home, and then she ends up marrying an indigenous man who beats her, and then works for an Indian center, and then she really embraces it and changes her name. So, you know, again, through each of the characterizations, he's created this, you know, it's like a quilt of characters which end up really revealing the complexity. And again, I think Tommy Orange is really trying to complicate things to move us away from stereotypes.
Yeah, I suppose the author you know, he ended the book with a very violent encounter and a tremendous amount of detail spent, as you mentioned, describing each person's personal experience with that violence. And there's some detail in that. What does this tell us about American society? How does it bookend and play into the author's foundational premise at the opening of the novel, which is the description of the identity of Native American tied into this genocidal experience, and then at the very end, it's not a genocide, but there's violence, and it seemed to me to be somehow saying something about the whole experience of in the Native community, with your foundational premise of your history and then what's going on today. And also American society, which is so, has so many guns and kids running around, or people running around with, violent intent and so on. There's just so much of that. And I'm wondering if there's a comment or a political comment even on American society with that.
Yeah, well, I think, the quick answer about violence is he's simply reflecting history in the present day. And, I think as a writer, he's using the narrative structure of drama and all of those things. But it's also a harsh reality. Sherman Alexie, another author, whether or not you like him or respect him, he talks about how guns are everywhere on the reservation. And, you combine guns with alcohol and you're going to have violence and abuse. And,
yeah.
Native women, one of the things that comes out is and is a harsh reality is the violence and disappearance of Native women. We were so taken with that story of the young white girl who was on this adventure with her boyfriend who ended up getting killed by him. When this is happening all the time, it doesn't get the press. One thing I'm, researching the book is he always knew he was going to end up at the powwow, and he's combining reality with fiction. The abyss moment is, or the climatic moment is at the powwow, and it is violent. And again, seeing how each of the characters individually, like Bill, who's married to Edwin's, I think it's Edwin's mother, his death scene, and how, he's a hero. Tony's a hero. How in adversity, when faced with horror, you really get to deepen your understanding of the moral code of, I think, of each of the characters in his illustrations. Those details, as gruesome as they are, you're like throughout the novel, his portrayal of getting inside these characters or looking down and outside of the characters at the experience, he is illustrating again the depth of each of the characters, and we deepen our understanding in their deaths of what their moral code is, in a way, I think.
And the meaning of their lives.
And the meaning of their lives.
So it was very poignant. Are there any other takeaways from this book you'd like our audience to know about?
I think it's a book which, when it came out in 2018, was well regarded, and I think it's highly illuminating. I think that one element of the book that makes it hard is the structure of the 12 characters. So having that list at the beginning and returning to it to remind yourself,
right?
In order to teach the book, I have to continually, I reread all the books multiple times as I'm teaching them to refresh my memory, but you really have to keep returning to it. So it's not an easy book for the violence that's portrayed, but also I think it's a highly illuminating book in terms of both history and deepening our understanding. And I think Orange fulfills his purpose of trying to move people away from stereotyping natives. So I think he's done a great job in trying to achieve that aim.
Yeah, the urban Indian, or
The urban Indian.
as he says, and the native peoples are here. We haven't disappeared. We're not all on the reservation. We're in the cities. We're here, we're there.
That's right. 70%, like, as I said, 80% of alcohol, the natives on reservations are alcoholic, but 70% of the natives live off the reservation.
Right.
And the cities are cities because of the resources and jobs. And so, yes, there are large populations are not, I mean, I think native culture is, the last I checked, 2% of the overall population in the United States, but there are natives living in the cities, and I saw that recently when I went to that concert. They're and they're thriving. They have the highest birth rate in the United States right now. So it's worth reading, and I'd highly recommend it.
No, and I have a copy of the book here. They're there, Tommy Orange. And it's a fascinating read. When it came out, as you said, in 2018, it was one of the best books of the year at the New York Times. And I think that people will get a lot out of it. And I guess one of the things that was a takeaway for me was that giving a new understanding and breaking stereotypes, a new understanding of peoples who live among us and who have an incredibly proud culture, and have all kinds of things obstacles that they need to face in order to be part of that and retain that culture.
Exactly.
I really appreciate you talking to Books at Berklee today, Eunice, and all your experience with this book and the various experiences you've had with you and your family in working with Indigenous peoples in the United States. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us at Books at Berklee. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Judy, for having Books at Berklee.
Thank you.